The sun was setting, and the air grew colder as the search party stood at the edge of the ravine. Below, the twisted remains of the university bus glinted in the dying light. The sound of distant wailing students carried through the dry valley. That was the moment we knew Ken and Amina weren't coming back. It all started as a typical university geology excursion, a week-long trip into the rugged hills of northern Kenya. We were 25 students, all eager to leave behind the endless lectures and whiteboards for the raw, unpredictable beauty of nature. The itinerary included field mapping, rock sampling, and studying tectonic formations that most of us had only read about in textbooks. Dr. Otieno, our professor, had planned this trip for months. He was the kind of teacher who believed that to study the earth, you had to get your hands dirty. Real geologists don't sit in classrooms, he always said, tapping the map on his office wall. The bus ride from Nairobi was loud and full of laughter. Ken, ever the comedian, spent most of the trip cracking jokes at anyone who dared fall asleep. Amina, quieter but just as sharp, sat by the window with her notebook, sketching the hills we passed. By the second day, we had set up camp near a series of cliffs overlooking a wide valley. The scenery was breathtaking. Even the most reluctant students were captivated. Ken found himself the star of everyone's Instagram stories, posing dramatically against the backdrop of red rocks and distant mountains. Amina, true to form, collected small rock samples, labeling them meticulously in her notebook. But as we ventured deeper into the terrain, cracks began to form in our plans. The weather turned unexpectedly harsh on the third day. The once clear skies grew cloudy, and a cold wind swept through the valley. Dr. Otieno, determined to stick to the schedule, insisted we press on. Our destination was a geological marvel, a series of ancient volcanic rocks that stood in a formation resembling a giant staircase. The locals we encountered along the way warned us. "That place is cursed," an old woman had said, her words dismissed by most of us as superstition. "People have died there. The rocks, they don't like visitors." Ken laughed it off, calling it village folklore. Amina didn't comment, but her hand paused on her notebook. By the time we reached the formation, the wind had picked up, howling through the rocky terrain. The climb was steeper than we had anticipated, and the loose rocks beneath our feet made every step treacherous. Dr. Otieno led the way, urging us to be cautious. Ken, always the daredevil, ignored him. He climbed higher than the rest of us, grinning as he reached a narrow ledge. "The view up here is insane," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. Amina hesitated but followed, her eyes fixed on her footing. She had always been the most meticulous among us, but that day, even she underestimated the instability of the rocks. No one knows exactly what happened next. Some say the wind grew stronger, others believe the rocks shifted beneath their weight. What we do know is that there was a sudden, deafening crack, followed by screams. Ken fell first. The ledge gave way, and his body disappeared into the abyss. Amina, who was just a few steps behind, tried to steady herself but slipped, her notebook fluttering from her hands as she went down. We froze, too stunned to react. It wasn't until Dr. Otieno's panicked voice broke the silence that we realized what had happened. The descent back to camp was a blur. Some students stayed behind to search, but the growing darkness and the increasing danger forced us to retreat. The local authorities were called, and a search and rescue team arrived the following morning. They found the bus first, overturned in the ravine. It had slid after a rock slide triggered by the unstable terrain. Inside were some of the supplies we had left behind and the personal belongings of our friends. By the time they recovered the bodies, the mood among us had shifted entirely. The laughter and camaraderie of the bus ride now felt like a distant memory. Amina's notebook was found a few meters from where she fell, its pages stained with dirt but still intact. Ken's watch was discovered among the rocks, its hands frozen at the time of the accident. We returned to campus weeks later, carrying the weight of what had happened. Dr. Otieno cancelled all future excursions, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet, haunted demeanor. Ken and Amina became legends in the geology department, their names spoken with a mix of reverence and sorrow. The cliffs where they fell are now known as Ken and Amina's Ledge, a somber reminder of how unpredictable nature can be. Every year, when new students ask about the excursion, we tell them the story, not to scare them, but to remind them of the risks we face in this field. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Ken's laughter echoing in the back of my mind, as though he's still cracking jokes from the ledge, urging us not to take life too seriously. Amina, no doubt, would roll her eyes at him, then jot it all down in her notebook. The university organized a memorial service for Ken and Amina a month after the accident. It was held in the campus quadrangle, under the acacia tree where geology students often gathered between classes. Their families were there, sitting in the front row, their grief palpable. Ken's mother couldn't hold back her tears as she described her son. Ken was always full of life, she said, clutching his graduation photo. He wanted to make rocks interesting for everyone. He believed geology wasn't just about stones but about the stories they told. Amina's father spoke next, his voice breaking as he recounted her childhood fascination with the earth. She would dig in our backyard for hours, convinced she would find treasure. To us, every rock she brought home was just a rock. But to her, they were pieces of history. As their classmates, we each shared memories of them. I remembered how Amina once spent an entire afternoon teaching me how to identify quartz veins in granite. She had the patience of a saint. Another student talked about how Ken's humor helped him survive his first semester when he had been ready to drop out. By the end of the service, we had planted 2 small saplings under the acacia tree, one for Ken and one for Amina. The department pledged to keep their memory alive by creating a scholarship in their honor, funding field research for students who couldn't afford it. But the scars ran deeper than memorials or scholarships could heal. Dr. Otieno resigned 2 months later. He sent an email to the department explaining his decision. I can no longer lead students into the field knowing the risks. Ken and Amina deserve better, and I will carry the weight of their loss for the rest of my life. The department was never quite the same. Field trips became less frequent, and the stories of Ken and Amina turned into cautionary tales passed down from one class to the next. Some of us struggled to continue. I often wondered if I could finish my degree, knowing the risks and the reality of what we faced. But I remembered Amina's determination and Ken's enthusiasm. They wouldn't want us to quit. They loved geology, and they saw beauty in the dangers. A year later, I revisited the cliffs. Alone this time. It wasn't part of any official excursion, just something I felt I had to do. Standing at the edge, I placed a small stone I had painted with their names on a flat rock near where they had fallen. The wind was gentle that day, whispering through the valley as if carrying their voices. I closed my eyes and imagined them there, Ken laughing, Amina sketching, both of them doing what they loved most. When I turned to leave, I felt a strange sense of peace. The cliffs were dangerous, yes, but they weren't evil. They were simply a reminder of how fragile we are, and how small we are in the face of nature's power. Back on campus, I found myself at the acacia tree, sitting between the now larger saplings planted in their memory. It felt like coming full circle, a reminder that even in tragedy, life goes on. Ken and Amina are gone, but they left a legacy far greater than any rock formation or map. They taught us to respect the earth, to cherish each moment, and to never take the beauty of life for granted. And for that, I always carry them with me, like the small quartz stone I keep in my pocket, a piece of the earth they loved, and a reminder of the friends I never forget. The years passed, and the story of Ken and Amina became a quiet, enduring part of the university's culture. Every new cohort of geology students learned about them, not just as a warning, but as an inspiration. Their names were etched into the scholarship plaque in the department, and every year, a promising student received the Ken and Amina Memorial Grant to fund their research. I graduated 2 years after the tragedy, but their memory followed me into the field. I couldn't look at a rock outcrop without hearing Amina's voice in my head, carefully identifying its layers, or think of Ken without smiling at how he would have turned even the most boring stratigraphy session into comedy gold. The cliffs where they died, however, remained a no-go zone. The university officially banned excursions to the site, and locals added their own layer of warnings, weaving tales about restless spirits and ill-fated visitors. Though I had been there once after the accident, the place had begun to take on a life of its own in my mind, a place too heavy with loss to visit again. That is, until 5 years after their passing, when I found myself drawn back to those cliffs for a very different reason. By then, I was working as a field geologist for an environmental consulting firm. One day, my supervisor called me into his office with a new assignment, a survey of mineral resources in the same valley where Ken and Amina had died. It was part of a government project to assess the region's potential for sustainable mining. At first, I hesitated. The thought of returning to that place churned up memories I had spent years trying to bury. But then I remembered something Ken once said during one of our excursions: if you don't face the Earth's challenges head-on, are you even a geologist? So I accepted the assignment, telling myself it was time to make peace with the past. When I arrived in the valley, it was as if no time had passed. The same rugged cliffs loomed over the landscape, the same dusty trails wound through the hills. But this time, I wasn't a student with a backpack full of notebooks. I was a professional with a team of engineers and geophysicists. As we set up camp near the cliffs, I felt the weight of history pressing down on me. I kept glancing at the ledge where it had all happened, now weathered by years of wind and rain. One evening, after the day's work was done, I wandered to the spot where I had left the painted stone in their memory. To my surprise, it was still there, partially buried in the dirt but unmistakable. I picked it up and brushed it off, tracing their names with my fingers. That night, I gathered my team and told them the story of Ken and Amina. It wasn't easy, and my voice broke more than once, but I wanted them to understand why this place mattered so much, not just to me, but to everyone who had ever studied geology at our university. By the end of the project, something strange happened. The cliffs, once a place of sorrow, began to feel like a site of healing. I found myself smiling at the thought of Amina meticulously cataloging the mineral samples we collected, or Ken turning our long, exhausting days into something bearable with his jokes. Before leaving, I placed the painted stone back on the ledge and added another next to it, a smooth, dark rock from the valley, engraved with the words, "The earth remembers. So do we." When I returned to the city, I felt lighter, as though a chapter of my life had finally closed. I shared my experience with the geology department, urging them to revisit the site, not as a place of fear, but as a symbol of resilience and respect for the unpredictable beauty of nature. The department took my suggestion to heart. The next generation of students began visiting the valley, not for formal excursions, but for quiet reflection. They planted wildflowers at the base of the cliffs and left small tokens, painted stones, handwritten notes, even fragments of quartz and basalt. Ken and Amina's legacy grew, spreading far beyond the university. Their story became one of perseverance, a reminder that even in loss, we can find purpose. And every time I return to those cliffs, because I do, now and then, I see not just the danger, but the life and passion that Ken and Amina brought to our lives. The earth remembers them, as do I. And in the rocks they loved so much, their story endures. Over time, the story of Ken and Amina became a kind of pilgrimage for geology students, both past and present. Alumni like me would return to the cliffs, not just to remember them but to reconnect with the essence of why we fell in love with the Earth's mysteries in the first place. The valley started to change as more people visited. What was once barren and forbidding began to bloom with life. The wildflowers planted by students spread, painting the rugged terrain with splashes of purple, yellow, and white. A small wooden plaque was erected near the cliffs with their names, along with an inscription that read, "Here, we honor those who dared to explore and embraced the earth's beauty with open hearts." Ken and Amina, forever part of these stones. It became a tradition for students to leave something behind during their visits, a sample of rock, a written reflection, or even a laugh shared in the memory of Ken's humor. I became a regular speaker at the university's orientation program for geology students, sharing Ken and Amina's story. It wasn't easy at first. Reliving the memories often felt like tearing open an old wound, but with each telling, it healed a little more. One day, after a particularly moving orientation session, a first-year student approached me. Her name was Leila, and she carried a battered notebook, much like the one Amina used to have. "I read about Ken and Amina in the scholarship brochure," she said. "They're the reason I decided to study geology." Her words stopped me in my tracks. She continued, her voice soft but steady. "I want to be like them, to see the world differently, to find beauty in things most people overlook. It's like they've already taught me something, even though I never met them." I smiled, feeling a lump form in my throat. "Then you're already on the right path, Leila," I said. It was in that moment I realized just how far their legacy had reached. Ken and Amina weren't just memories to us anymore, they were guiding lights for generations of students who dared to dream. As the years rolled on, the geology department introduced an annual excursion to the valley, aptly named the Ken and Amina expedition. It wasn't mandatory, but students flocked to it, drawn by the mix of adventure, learning, and reflection. On the first day of the expedition, before any rocks were sampled or maps drawn, the students gathered at the cliffs. Someone would always read a passage from Amina's notebook, which her family had graciously donated to the university after her death. Her words, written in neat, careful handwriting, captured her love for the earth and her insatiable curiosity. One of her entries became a tradition to read aloud. "The earth speaks to us in ways most people can't hear. It whispers its history, its struggles, and its triumphs through every stone, every ridge, and every grain of sand. To understand it is to love it." Afterward, the students would spend a moment in silence, imagining the two friends who had walked these trails before them, full of life and passion. On the 10th anniversary of their passing, the geology department organized a major commemoration. Alumni from across the continent returned to campus to honor Ken and Amina. The event was held under the now mighty trees planted in their memory, their branches casting dappled shade over the crowd. Leila, now a recent graduate and the recipient of the Ken and Amina Memorial Grant, gave the keynote speech. She spoke about her first visit to the cliffs and how the story of Ken and Amina had inspired her to push boundaries in her research on volcanic rock formations. "They taught me that geology isn't just about science," she said. "It's about connection to the earth, to each other, and to the stories we leave behind." Her words resonated deeply with everyone present, including Ken's mother and Amina's father, who had become honorary members of the geology family. As the sun set that evening, casting a golden glow over the campus, I found myself standing near the trees, reflecting on how far we'd all come. The weight of their loss was still there, but it had transformed into something else, something lighter, brighter, and more enduring. Ken and Amina may have left us far too soon, but they became more than friends, more than classmates. They became legends. And in every stone we study, every cliff we climb, and every story we share, they live on.